If you look long enough at this galaxy, you'll see the lines. Lines that divide us. Lines that connect us. Lines that can be erased. And lines that can be crossed. They are the rules that define the game. Borders to enforce, horizons to explore, webs to weave, ropes to climb, and ties to bind. Our lives dangled on delicate threads, our legacies secured with broken chains, our history written in strokes of blood. But I want you to remember, all these lines are yours to draw. This is your dynasty.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special little Star Dynasties talk in celebration of it leaving early access on September 1st on Steam. My name is Eric Daams. I'm the community manager at Iceberg Interactive, and I'm thrilled to be joined by none other than Glen Pawley, the lead developer of Star Dynasties. Glen, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Eric, and thanks for setting this up. I'm really excited, of course, to be for the game to be reaching the 1.0 and finally being out of early access.
The much vaunted 1.0.
Yes.
Yeah, I think early access has been a pretty wild ride, pretty short ride compared to some early access titles. So I'm very excited as well.
It's definitely been quite intense. I mean, that's what we wanted to go into early access for, that kind of fire hose of user feedback, and we certainly got a lot of
it. Yeah, we did. Got a lot of feedback from existing players. There might be some people watching who have never even heard of Star Dynasties before. Can you give them a quick rundown, the dreaded elevator pitch of Star Dynasties?
Sure, absolutely. So Star Dynasties is a sci-fi strategy game that's set in this universe after the destruction of Earth. It's a feudal galaxy, and it's populated by hundreds of procedurally generated characters. And the focus is on the politics and the drama that arises from all these characters, their machinations, their agendas, all trying to make their political house the most powerful house of the galaxy.
Awesome. Yeah, political intrigue in a Game of Thrones in space kind of world is how I would refer to it. But I want to touch first upon some of the background lore. You already mentioned that it's a post-apocalyptic world, or post-apocalyptic worlds, I guess. What was the choice behind choosing to go for a post-apocalyptic sci-fi setting?
Well, the mechanics of the game and the political system we wanted to model is a feudal one. Now, a kind of a feudal system has some necessary elements from a social perspective, from a political perspective, that is kind of really hard to marry with sci-fi. And in fact, sci-fi that does feudal tropes, it tends to kind of be fairly unrealistic, because like one of the things that exemplifies the feudal era was that commerce was at an all-time low. It's kind of hard to model that in a sci-fi future when presumably we've got, massive trading ships, that are crossing the galaxy. So I felt that for the feudal system that we have in the game to be realistic, we also needed to model a sci-fi universe that has gone through a collapse, that is now in a dark age. And that's what's allowed a feudal political system to come back.
Yeah, I love that you actually mentioned a dark age, because one thing I picked up on, and one thing I really enjoy about being able to immerse myself in this story of a pre-collapse era, is that this isn't too far from the past, right? This is obviously a distant future, but we know about an actual collapse in real life in the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire. and I think that really helps immerse yourself in what it would be like to live in a world like that. Because usually when we think of sci-fi stories, we think of this idyllic future. Well, maybe not usually, but sometimes we do. And this is very far from that. It's kind of reminiscent of the actual medieval era.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think if we think of most space opera and science fiction, it is exactly as you say. It extends our current technological growth, of course, to something much more superior to what we have now, but that also extends usually in the political and social realm. Even to be fair, as I said, other feudal sci-fi like Dune is the classic example. Dune, the human
Of
empire,
course, yeah.
spans the galaxy, millions of planets, and those planets are like Coruscant in Star Wars. You know, it's a massive city that spans the entire planet. While with Star Dynasties, we're trying to be a bit more gritty and realistic, and this is actually a kind of a low population future. The collapse has depopulated. There isn't even that much living space left because Earth is destroyed, and all that's left is the colonies that survived that collapse that weren't even intended as a living space for humanity yet. We still hadn't reached yet that level of expansion and technological advance.
Yeah, you actually immediately pivoted to something I wanted to touch upon, which is the colony improvements system in the game, which kind of ties into this patchwork society, or a bundle of patchwork societies that are only able to use and repair what is left of before the collapse, right?
Yes, so the way we've modeled it is that the colonists that survive, they live inside colonies that were built before the collapse, and they don't really have anymore the technological or the industrial might to extend these colonies significantly. These colonies were built when Earth was at its prime, shipping huge amounts of resources from the solar system, and food in particular, which kind of, after all that went away, all we've got is these survivors living in what remains in these colonies for hundreds of years. And in the game, we model these colonies slightly differently. So each system has its own different set of installations that have survived from the pre-collapse, and all of it is kind of an industrial teaming, because in the setting, the early expansion age of humanity, was out there building things like factories, like starports for expansion and research stations. We hadn't yet reached an era where we've got massive cities outside of Earth.
Hmm. Yeah, you've set the stage beautifully. I think. I think everybody has a pretty good grasp of the very dark, grimdark future, even that we're living in. It's not the idyllic space traveling future that we're looking for. Um, but even for the nobility, life is pretty bad, right? Not just the peasants.
Well, of course, especially in a feudal world, we're modeling the fact that the nobility has all the power, and so obviously their lives are clearly better than the lives of the peasants. But, well, just like, I guess, in any situation, they've got their own constraints and problems too, because they're obviously at each other's throats. So your world might be more comfortable, presumably, in terms of animal comforts, food, rest, entertainment. But at the same time, there are other houses plotting your downfall. I mean, quite literally in the game, of course, because as a leader, you are at risk of being conquered, assassinated, defamed, and therefore abandoned by all your loyal subjects. So you certainly have your own worries, even if you are at the top of the heap, or relatively at the top of the heap.
Yeah, I love actually how that ties into the lack of resources, even for the nobility. How that ties into the actual game with a house size limit. I remember the very first time I was playing the game, I was actually like, "What do you mean house size limit? I'm a noble. I'm the highest position you could be." Well, I wasn't an archon, but yeah, resources are obviously limited. Talk to me how that ties into how the lore and kind of the mechanics in the game going to get together in that instance.
Well, it was actually explicitly trying to find a good justification for a technical problem. So, because the game is modeled in such a way that characters in it will marry and have children, that means you're adding characters to the game as the game goes on. And so, an early problem that I had while building the game is that you could, in theory, have runaway growth, where the current families have children, then they all marry, then they have more children, and suddenly you've got a character explosion. And well, at the minimum, your computer would bog down and not be able to handle that. So I needed some way to limit that. And of course, I could have just limited that artificially, and you'd see people not having kids, and it would all just be hand waved away. But given the setting, it made perfect sense that there would be a cultural limitation around having children, because we are kind of in the extreme kind of Malthusian problem, where humanity, having so little living space, has already maxed it out, and having children is almost a luxury. So, naturally from that arose the idea that there would be a cultural taboo about having too many kids, and so even you as a noble, there's a kind of a cultural expectation that you will live within your means, that you will control the size of your house. And that became, after a while, an interesting game mechanic on its own, in terms of how many house members you would have, and therefore how many workers you have in our worker placement mechanic.
Awesome. Yeah, I always thought it was just, it started off with the lore, resources are limited, therefore there is a house size limit, but it sounds like it actually started out as kind of almost a performance problem with the game.
Yes, it's true for I guess just about everything. Either you start out from sometimes you're going to find something in the setting and it just doesn't fit with other things you've defined in the setting, so the setting has to take precedence. But then every now and then we've got a technical problem, or we're trying to tell a particular story, and that's what prompts the thought, what would it work like in this setting, or what are the viable range of things that fit into our setting. So it's kind of an iterative system.
Yeah, we've talked about the pre-collapse, the era, of course, before the actual collapse happened. Will you ever share with us what the actual collapse was? Or is that a top secret, even to you?
We have left it a bit ambiguous for now, because we think until we can reflect that in the game in a meaningful way, we'd rather kind of leave that under wraps. What we have shared in the game is the game has this mechanic called the expeditions, where your house is always on the lookout for potential artifacts from the pre-collapse universe, because obviously technology is power. We don't understand technology anymore, so it's not like we know it's like a black box. It's like magic. But obviously we want as much of it as we can, because any technological artifact increases our power. So your house, sends people regularly on expeditions, and certain adventures happen, and there are story events in the game that take you through these adventures, and that's the expeditions mechanic. And because obviously you pull quite a bit from the pre-collapse era in those stories, so we kind of have fleshed out that universe quite a bit. So you'll get some tidbits of information about the factions that were the most influential factions in the pre-collapse. And so there's absolutely a rich seam of stories there that we can keep mining. Absolutely.
Was the expeditions mechanic, was that something that was shaped in a different way because of community feedback? Because that was, of course, our second major update on the roadmap. So can you speak a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, in fact, I would say the expeditions mechanic is a pure reaction to user feedback, and it kind of joined together two strands of user feedback. And one was, we're a sci-fi strategy game, and most sci-fi strategy games have technology. They have research. Now,
Sounds difficult when it's a post-apocalyptic world where nobody has
yeah,
any technology.
exactly. So I struggled to see for a long time how technology could be in the game in any meaningful way, because exactly as you say, we don't have scientists, we don't understand the technology. It's a blank box, and so kind of bolting on some kind of research system always felt to me very artificial. But that's just kind of something that feels out of place not having it in a sci-fi strategy game.
Mm-hmm.
And the other strand of feedback was when we launched that, you know what, we could have a bit more sci-fi flavor in the game, that we're still not bringing out this world richly enough. And so looking at those two strands, the idea was, let's do technology by having these stories in the game about your house's hunt for relics of the past, and that both allows us to write a bunch of sci-fi stories about cloaking technologies and clones and mutants that are discovered from the past and experimental serums that you might inject yourself with, and all sorts of interesting storylines, and also address technology head on. This is what technology is in the world of Star Dynasties. There's you're not trying to come up with some new form of torpedo, because to be honest, no one understands how they work. We just know how to use existing replicators or fabricators to build more poor copies of them, and that kind of works. But we're not inventing more of them.
I love how almost every expedition event, your lead scientist goes, "Yeah, I don't know how it's gonna work. Might be side effects. Probably will be side effects. Only one way to find out."
Spoiler: they usually are.
They usually are. I haven't spoken to my son in a while after I put that chip in his brain. Sorry. I also love these expedition events. They kind of feel like opening a box or a gift box on Christmas Day. They always come with these, or often come with these cool toys that you can use to strengthen your house. I think that was a beautiful solution to two strands of community feedback. I should put it.
It works like a board game mechanic, where every few turns, based on how good your house is in the technology area, you draw a card from a deck that is a story that gives you something. Not always. There are one or two which are a little bit tricky to navigate, but in general they'll give you something. And some of them are straight stories, and some of them might give you a bag of tools that you can use for a bit. So there's a wide range of possibilities there.
Yeah, I also very much enjoy how getting any of these awesome, pre-collapse relics improves your standing within the world, right? Because reputation is a big deal in Star Dynasties.
Reputation is a very big deal. In fact, reputation is probably the central mechanic of Star Dynasties, and that's perfectly logical because the game is about politics. It might look at first glance, if you're taking a look at the screenshots that are on our Steam page, it might look like another sci-fi strategy game, and therefore you might expect warfare, you might expect an economic side, and you might expect the usual diplomacy. And actually we're quite different, because our focus is primarily on the political side, and therefore about the political ramification of your actions. And the central mechanic that models that is, there's obviously an opinion that every character has of you, and you also have opinion of other characters, and every character has an opinion of each other character. But on top of that, each character has a reputation, which is like when you do something that has a global impact. Like if you declare war would be a good example, but if you do something really mean, like, I don't know, torture a relative or kill someone for no reason, or get caught trying to defame someone. And
now I feel called out.
And if you do those things, your reputation tanks, which is equivalent to everyone in the world now lowering their opinion of you. And so, and because that every time you lower or raise your reputation, that has a significant impact on what your future kind of the behavior of everyone in the world is going to be like in the future. So it absolutely is. Managing your reputation ends up being one of the main things you're doing, which it almost wasn't planned, but it's perfectly realistic, because that's a huge part of politics. It's about managing your appearance as you're trying to portray yourself as this benevolent ruler, when in reality you're doing all these nasty things behind the scenes, and it's kind of this to and fro. You do something nice that makes you look good, so now you can do something bad and spend that goodwill you've gotten.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily planned exactly that way, but it's turned out to be a very kind of realistic mechanic.
What do you mean exactly when you say it wasn't planned out to be that way?
Well, that's a very interesting, I guess, story, because in many ways, Star Dynasties, I wanted to explore mechanics that were off the beaten path. So when I sat down and started working on Star Dynasties, the plan on what the final shape would look like, it was actually fairly vague, because the idea was to iterate from the very beginning and see what worked and what didn't. And reputation, and particularly honor, which is like the biggest part of reputation, and it's this whole moral system that's implemented in the game, they were discovered through that iterative process. I didn't sit down and think through what I've just told you about reputation and said, okay, now how do I model it? Because that's the central, or one of the central dynamics of politics. That didn't occur to me. That I discovered that through iteration, through discovering what works and what doesn't. And then it became obvious after enough play testing. That's it. That's the fundamental keystone of the game.
Are there any other systems that didn't really make the cut that you can tell us about?
Well, yeah, it's happened both ways, of course, because the other side of that iterative process is that sometimes you are going to go down rabbit holes because you're trying things out that are absolutely new. The advantage of staying on well-treaded ground is that it's well-treaded because it works, because it's fun.
Yeah.
And so going off the beaten path comes with dangers. So yeah, we've definitely gotten, I've definitely been bitten more than once by a mechanic that I've implemented, and it just turned out not to be as much fun as I hoped. And then we've scaled it back, or we've cut it, or we've filtered it out.
Yeah, I think we have a perfect example of that is the aforementioned colony improvements, right? It started with just infrastructure, which didn't really say much, and now we have all these, randomly generated colony improvements that have a wide range of effects.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, another example would be the way Unrest was modeled initially, which was purely random, and that, again, through user feedback, it's been changed through a much more kind of predictable and manageable process. So yeah, we've definitely had a lot of that. And I'm sure there still are other mechanics right now in the game that will be improved, as we go forward that way.
I will say I kind of miss the old Unrest mechanic where it just sometimes very randomly popped up. There was maybe a 1% chance that the population would rise up, and they just suddenly did. And you're just sitting there like, let them eat cake, maybe?
I think, no, because it's interesting to hear you say that, because one of the things that's been fascinating to me as the game designer is to see how kind of mechanics appeal to different players in different ways. So one of the biggest kind of divides that I see is the kind of player who is happy to roll with the punches, and the kind of player who would rather have quite a lot of control and predictability in their universe. And that's been really kind of hard to navigate, because Star Dynasties is about trying to model a set of characters in a realistic way, or at least in a more realistic way than perhaps you would find in a typical strategy game like Civilization, where in fact it's really impersonal.
Yeah.
And real life, well, it throws curveballs at you all the time. And that's part of what makes it real. But some dynamics have and some players do like that, and some players struggle a little bit with the fact, for example, exactly as you said, at the beginning, we found that a lot of players struggled with the idea that you couldn't predict when a rebellion might happen on your system. And so it's been a real balancing act between trying to stay true to the mechanics that are about that kind of more realism and more character stories. Like there are plenty of events in the game where you're playing the game and something just happens to you out of your control. For example, your character falls in love, and they might fall in love with a character, and it's really inconvenient for you that they did, because maybe there's just no way you can actually make that happen. And being in love in Star Dynasties, it gives you a small penalty, and it's annoying, obviously. And the penalty models that you're distracted as a character. You're in love, so it kind of affects your. So, and that's nice, because it motivates you as a player to do something about it, to try to marry that character or to try to have an affair with them on the sly. And so it creates interesting stories. And now we've added a seduce mechanic with other rulers, so that you have more tangible tools to kind of do something about it. But I guess especially before we added a more tangible tool to do something about it, some players felt that it was something out of their control. So not everyone reacts to these mechanics in the same way, and it's been a real balancing act to kind of get the kind of meet both worlds well.
Yeah, I think the unrest change is a good example of a way you've given us more control. Some of us who like the more chaotic games, like myself, we silently clamor for the old one back. But I do think there's a good mixture between having control and not having control. So I, as a player, I have control over going to a feast, yes or no, but I don't have control over what's going to happen at that feast. And I really love that, because I like just clicking on a button and just throwing myself in the deep end and not worrying about what's going to happen. I'll deal with that later. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but how do you feel about that lack of control? How do you feel about it personally?
I think playing Star Dynasties, playing Star Dynasties is like, let's take Civilization as a game that I can contrast Star Dynasties to. Now, I love Civilization. A long-time player of the series, but I love it for different reasons. Now, Civilization, you're very much in control of almost everything. The only thing you're not in control of is the shape of the original map, which determines where you're going, what you might find and how you're going to build your original cities, and obviously what the other handful of AI opponents do, and you might react to them. But almost everything else is within your control, and there's very little kind of randomness in the events that happen to you. Star Dynasties, it's a lot more like I guess real life. You've got a plan, you've got a life plan, but life continually throws you curveballs.
Yeah.
One of your vassals that you thought you didn't have to worry about, they die, and their heir decides to accept an offer of marriage with a neighboring leader and betrays you and joins their faction. And that's a very different style of game. It's a game where what you're doing is you are always setting yourself up to take advantage of opportunities and to try to always roll with the punches. So it's you'll find yourself making a plan, and then two turns later, you're setting out 3 fires. Yeah. That's gone, and sometimes it comes together beautifully, sometimes life gets in the way. So it's a very different mentality, and it's I think that's part of what makes Star Dynasties its own game, rather than a I guess a run-of-the-mill sci-fi strategy game. And I've kind of tried really hard to make sure that that DNA doesn't get etched away too much by the improvements and the occasional piece of feedback that has tried to pull us in a kind of a more standard direction.
Yeah, I think that the lack of control that you usually have, this kind of semi-reactive playstyle that you need to adopt to succeed, I think that makes that one moment where you finally do have real control over, for instance, another house joining your faction. I think it makes that more satisfying because you finally feel like you are the one atop it all. You know, your little finger and his machinations finally come to fruition.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I mean, those exactly are the moments that really come together nicely, when you have seduced a character, or when you have defamed their master to destroy the relationship between a nearby ruler and one of their vassals, while attracting that vassal, while pointing your guns, metaphorically speaking, at that vassal, so that he's scared and thinks that he needs, his existing ruler won't be able to defend him. So you're constantly building these little advantages, and it's like, I guess it's like dominoes, and every now and then you can tip one and it does create the chain reaction you want, and sometimes life comes in and kicks your domino stack and you've got to try it again.
My dominoes got tipped, I think, just yesterday while I was playing. My heir was my son. He got sick. And right after that, my daughter asked, hey, Dad, who's your favorite kid? And my son was on his deathbed at the time. So I was very much thinking, well, if he's not going to make it, I'm not going to, I want to keep my daughter on my good side. I think those are, those emergent narratives that just kind of pop up randomly, and I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's what I like about the game as the designer is that it still has the power to surprise me. Like if I'm playtesting, sometimes a string of events will happen that make me laugh or make me smile because they're so kind of poignant, or someone will stab someone else in the back, and then they'll get their comeuppance, and it's those little stories that the game generates that are incredibly satisfying to me.
Yeah, I've had plenty of times where I kind of hate another character, another noble leader of their house, for years. Multiple turns, just absolutely despise them. And then suddenly they'll ask to join my faction because they had a falling out with their own Archon, their own leader. And I always have this evil mustache twirling moment where I go, well, look who came crawling back. I think, and I don't want to step on any other strategy game's toes here, but I think that's something that's kind of lacking, is that randomness in the stories that creates.
I'm not sure I would use the term lacking, because I think there's space for many different styles. As I said, I absolutely love the engine building gameplay of Civ, where you're essentially tweaking and creating this kind of machine, for want of a better word, that produces resources and units, and you're using them to conquer an opponent. And I love that style of game, and I mean, we've got the advantage that we can have many different kind of games at the same time.
Yeah. Thank you for saving me on that one. I want to take another look at something that I think is unique to Star Dynasties, and that is the way that AI also has to abide by those rules of honor and reputation that we talked about. I really enjoy the way that I never feel like the AI is cheating in any way. I don't feel like they got to where they are, those dastardly Archons, our neighbors, that they got where they are through, just being the AI, but they also play the game. They snub you by not inviting you to feasts, or they also threaten your vassals to join them or perish.
there's quite a lot to unpack there, I suppose.
Yeah.
The AI, as a general rule, the AI doesn't cheat. It is working by exactly the same rules as you, and the reason that is because the game is trying to, again, kind of be a simulation, I mean, of an ability, and it's in some sense you're not really you're not playing against a set of AI opponents. You're not playing against a set of AI opponents that are the rulers of the factions around you. That's not really it at all. You're playing in a world because they'll be overthrown. A ruler's heir will take over. A ruler in their system might create a rebellion, and in the rebellion swallow up their previous faction. So when you don't have like a fixed set of rulers and opponents that you're playing against, instead you've just got a cast of hundreds of characters. And any ruler today could be cast down tomorrow, and vice versa. It's harder to climb up, but it's a very dynamic world, and it's more that every character has to abide by the cultural rules of the setting, rather than your AI opponents, which isn't really it's not a direct concept actually. And honor has proven to be one of the most interesting mechanics of the game, because
Definitely.
it ties so strongly to reputation. And it's the idea that, as I said before, there are actions that when you do them, you're breaking some kind of moral code, and therefore you're inviting a kind of universal disapproval. So if you kill someone, thou shalt not kill, everyone's going to dislike you for it, which sounds straightforward enough. But what makes the honor mechanic interesting is that the game understands the following logic, which is, you might say John killed Jack, so John is a villain. But imagine we lived in a world where Jack had killed John's son, and now John kills Jack in revenge. Now, okay, none of us are going to say John did a good thing, but you can kind of understand, especially in our traditional setting, our feudal, eye for an eye, much simpler moral and social system. Like, he's kind of justified. You can't blame John for seeking revenge, and that's what the honor system in Star Dynasties understands. In fact, it's at the heart of how you will play politics. If you just try to go up against another ruler and declare war, you don't have a moral justification for that. It's a sin because it adds chaos to the world. So culturally, it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
But if you can find an excuse, maybe you discover something that ruler has done. Or, for example, a typical story might be that ruler might be particularly nasty to one of his vassals. Maybe fines them excessively, or kills one of their house members, or has an affair with someone they shouldn't have. Then later down the line, you seduce that vassal to betray the ruler and join your faction. Okay, you've done your own sin. Let's leave that aside for the moment. Mm-hmm. But now that ruler might come to you and say, as my liege, I demand that you pursue justice on my behalf against my former ruler who did these nasty things against me. And obviously you'd go with a big smile on your face. Of course, I'm more than happy to provide justice for you. Yeah, I would never attack that other guy, but I will do the honorable thing and declare war just to avenge your honor.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can see how it creates interesting connections in the game and interesting opportunities, which kind of ties back to the idea that you're not kind of sitting there while you're playing the game thinking, okay, I will build up my armies and then I will attack. No, you're sitting there thinking, how do I prepare myself so that when the right political opportunity comes along, I can take it? Yes, get stronger against that ruler, so that as I can get, or how can I engineer the opportunity? What trick can I play?
Your honor really is kind of the main weapon, I would say, in Star Dynasties. I really enjoy, finding out secrets about someone I dislike, and then when they are in a bad spot, by doing something dishonorable, I release that secret into the world, and their honor tanks even more.
Absolutely.
And then all their vassals are kind of ripe for the picking.
Yeah, because you kind of tip them over the edge. They make a misstep, put themselves in a slightly precarious position politically, but not necessarily enough to do something to end them. And that's when you spring your hidden weapon. And
usually it's defaming them, claiming that what's the usual one? They did human experiments. That's always a fun one. Yeah. But talking about actual weapons, there is, of course, a combat system in the game. It's not always honeyed words and a venomous tongue. Can you talk to me a little bit about why it is the way it is? Because it is very board game-like, with roles and almost like combat cards that you play.
The combat system, it's evolved quite a bit, and I guess it ties back to our previous conversation about how it's gone through that iterative process and through user feedback. So always from the beginning, working on Star Dynasties, the focus was on the politics and the drama that arises from that politics. So I was never focused on the idea that I wanted to have a combat system that would be its own attraction, its own, let's play Star Dynasties because the tactical combat is really good in it. Because not because that's a bad thing to have in a game, absolutely, but because obviously I was very focused on the political experience, and there's limited time and energy to focus on everything at once. And And that was definitely one area where user feedback all throughout the alphas and the betas, they said, a little bit more detail here would be nice as well. So we did. We added the system that you see now in videos and screenshots, where you will have a fleet in a certain location, and during combat, and you build it up by calling in people to support you when you want to attack. This actually speaks to the biggest, I would say, challenge of modeling combat in the game, because in Star Dynasties, I've really gone out of my way to model the fact that you do not control your vassals. You have their loyalty, hopefully, which means, for example, when you want to attack, what you're hoping is that they will actually join your attack. And to be fair, if they don't, they'll be committing a crime in the honor system that we talked about before.
Yeah, that is also based on your reputation, the likeliness that they'll actually join you. Yeah.
Exactly. So yes, if you've been particularly tyrannical, you're likely to be abandoned at a critical moment. So that's one of the side effects. But what I didn't want to model is the idea that you just have full control over your vassals' forces, because that's absolutely not what the feudal system worked. That's not how it worked at all. You were, and that's what made the feudal system what it is. The fact that the king or the head was so dependent on the loyalty of their vassals. The control was quite loose, and so the model, almost the most interesting thing in combat is who's actually going to join me and who's going to join my opponent. Are all my vassals going to be loyal, and am I going to call them in? Am I going to manage to call them in on this fight at this location on the map? But then on top of that, the actual combat depends on the skills of the commander that you bring in to wield the combat, and that will be a member of your house. And that's where we tie it back to the previous conversation about house size limits, and having the right people in your house makes a big difference to the game. And the mechanics in the actual combat are a little bit like borrowed a mechanic from the classic endless space, where you choose a battle action in a series of 3 rounds, that will influence the battle, hopefully in your direction.
Awesome. Actually, now that we're talking about combat, combat is, I think, something that quite a few people struggle with initially, myself included. I just now that I have you here, how do you set up a round of combat? Do you do preparatory work by maybe defaming some people and making sure that their relation with their leader is maybe not as ideal as it should be?
Okay, so first of all, let me explain for whoever's watching this where that kind of initial hump of understanding combat comes from. So in Star Dynasties, you don't actually move units around the map. You're not kind of, getting a fleet of ships from one of your vassals and moving them towards the border and then preparing them for an attack. Again, that was about streamlining the tactical side of the game so that you're focused primarily on the political. Instead, it's all abstracted. And what happens is that when you're looking at any star system on the map, the game will tell you, if you were to have a combat at that location, this is what would probably, this is the fleet you would probably have access to if all your vassals showed up. And that's kind of a bit of a different concept to wrap your head around, because in most games we're so used to the idea that you do get individual units from everywhere, kind of group them up, and then move them as an army. So the idea that instead the game is kind of predicting what you might get, but you'll only actually know when you trigger a combat and force people to take a decision whether to support you or not. That is, I appreciate, a bit of a challenging concept the very first time you play it. And we've iterated quite a bit on making that clear, but admittedly, of course, that is something that we still get a lot of questions by, and we'll continue to try to improve it. So in terms of how I would set up a combat, there's the preparation that you're doing before combat. You've got access to a plan attack assignment, so you can assign one of the characters in your house to increase your chances at a particular location, and you get a fleet-wide bonus. You can improve the military standing of your house. You can also assign members of your house to rebuild the fleets of any systems that are close to your target and that you're going to be calling in. You also want to improve the relationships with any vassals or even non-vassals that are right next to the target that you think you could use there. So for example, if you're trying to attack or conquer a system that borders both you and, say, another ruler, that ruler, and you think that ruler could make the difference. In fact, even if you don't need that ruler, you might want to bring him on side because he could join the other guy.
Oh yeah.
And there's plenty of combats that I've had to retreat from, even though on paper I have the superior force, because that person. And you can sometimes be fouled up in ways you don't expect. For example, you might launch an attack, and again, the game tells you, if all your vassals show up here, you should be able to take this system. But then you start the combat, and it turns out you didn't pay attention to the fact that one of your vassals is the brother-in-law of the ruler you're attacking, and he doesn't show up, of course. And okay, that's something you can deal with later.
It's also dishonorable, right, to actively attack your family. Yeah.
Oh yes, if it was your family, it would be even more dishonorable to attack them. Yeah. But here I'm saying it's not your family, but it's the family of someone.
Yeah, of your vassal.
Of your vassals. So he's much likelier to bail on you at the critical moment. And if you're not taking that into account yourself, you can get, it can be a nasty surprise at the last minute. But also, I really want to point out that in some sense, it was almost necessary for that dynamic to happen, to have this view of combat. If the game was set up so that you did move units about the map and you just picked the unit up from the territory of that vassal, who is the brother or brother-in-law of your opponent, moved his unit all the way and attacked, what would happen? You wouldn't have the potential for that person to abandon you. So again, the focus on politics allows stories to arise that you wouldn't quite get in a more standard approach. Yes. Admittedly, we do have some teething issues because it's a relatively new concept. So it's we're learning how to explain it to the player.
I love how everything kind of ties into the combat system, because at first glance it might look too simple, right? Because you're just choosing someone to lead your troops, and then you're just choosing battle tactics if you are the one commanding your troops. But in actuality, it's more about the setup. It's more about managing your own vassals and your relationships with your own vassals and those close to you.
Yes, absolutely. Once you've played the game a few times and you've understood the dynamics, the battle is obviously, battles can go in different directions. It's the roles in the rounds of combat and the tactics chosen, and fundamentally the commander chosen by the other side, who you don't frequently have visibility of. So you might see on paper, I'm going to have the biggest army, but then their commander happens to be some 70-year-old super general with
100 in his war score.
Exactly. So that can still foul you up. But barring those elements, once you understand the dynamics, you can put those dominoes in place before the combat ever starts. Who is going to side with me? Does this bordering ruler like me more than the opponent? So what are the odds that it'll go in my direction rather than his? And it's frequently, but not always, the case that the combat will be decided in your head before you go for it. You go for the risk.
Awesome. Yeah, I've honestly, I was one of those people who just kind of avoided the combat as much as possible and tried to worm my way into supremacy by defaming and having people join me at the right time. So this is a refresher for me as well.
And to be fair, it is possible. It is conceivably possible to win the game with very little combat, because so much of it is in the politics. Like, for example, if you have a ruler and your territories border in such a way that his capital, that is his home system, is directly on your border, and you have an overwhelming fleet and you attack with it, or you threaten to attack with it, that ruler might very well say, okay, I hold my hand up. I don't even want to try this. I will submit to be your vassal or to be part of your empire. So it is conceivably possible to get quite far in the game without actually getting to blows. But I'm not saying it's going to be a common situation.
Yeah, no, I have yet to win without actually going into combat. But usually by the time it happens, I am in such a position that's almost impossible to lose. I say almost because it has happened a few times. All right, so you talked about the combat not being maybe not a central part in what your thought process should be while playing Star Dynasties. It really should be about the familial part and the political intrigue. How should you be thinking while playing Star Dynasties?
So in Star Dynasties, the objective of the game is to make your house the most powerful house in the galaxy. And you do that by essentially having at least half the galaxy swear fealty to you, either directly or indirectly, that they become your vassals. And you do this primarily in two ways. You're either going to conquer territory outright and then award it to someone who becomes your vassal, or you force a ruler to, well, force is a strong word, you get a ruler to somehow join your faction. And you can do that either by forcing them, basically you're pointing a gun at their head and going, you'd better join me or else, or simply by seducing them, by making it seem like a more attractive proposition to be part of your empire. So now, as I kind of said earlier, when you're playing the game, you're not constantly using, if you think of Civ, in Civ, your mindset is, I have these resources and I'm going to consume them to increase my capacity to generate more resources in the most efficient way possible, build as many units as I can in the process, and use those units to conquer the map. That's your general kind of top level thinking, your mental process. In Star Dynasties, what you're thinking is you're thinking, how can I set up the board across all my various frontiers so as to improve the chances that I can either conquer a system or get a ruler to accept my supremacy. So you'd say, okay, are there any nearby systems where the balance of power on them is close enough that with a bit of planning and a bit of effort, I could change that balance further in my favor, and then take the gamble and the political hit of attacking it. Are there any rulers around me that are not strongly in the clutches of their ruler? Like, is someone dissatisfied? So maybe they are a target to twist them, turn them over to my side. So that's your heart. That's kind of what you're thinking. You think, how can I change the balance of power, both militaristically but also politically, along my frontiers to try to acquire more territory? But then internally as well, you're thinking you will get stability issues. Like, you're going to have your vassals come to you and, because they're fighting among themselves all the time, trying to do the same thing that you'll be trying to do. And they'll throw a spanner in the works. Like, one of them will come to you and essentially twist your arm to do something about another vassal, but that vassal you might actually prefer to keep on your side than the original one. So you've got a political dilemma whether to look bad by closing a blind eye to whatever crimes the one you like has committed, or so you're constantly having to fight these fires as you grow larger. You're trying to change the balance of power to take advantage of opportunities to then acquire more territory, but you're also trying to set things up so that the reverse doesn't happen. So that when you get run of bad luck, or when something happens that goes against you, you've got enough strength to withstand it. So your
goodwill.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
So your arc on, if for example you start out the game and you are a vassal of another archon, so you're still at the stage where you're not even independent, and you're kind of motivated to keep them on your side because they hold a lot of power over you. And if they decide, I actually don't, you're gonna step down and someone else is going to replace you, you could find yourself suddenly at war with a major power. So you're always thinking ahead about how to change the dynamics to be as much in your favor as they can be. That's kind of your mindset. You're looking at your reputation all the time, because there's this dynamic where if your reputation is high, you can take risks. You can carry out that war that actually isn't justified because you've got enough goodwill that you can spend it. But then when you do, now you've got to go back and take it slow, take a step back, be a bit more defensive. It's more about making sure you've got allies who will join your side if you need them, rather than on making sure that you've got allies that will attack a target if you decide to attack it. Have I got all the characters in my house, being useful? Have I, if someone is unmarried, is there an alliance I can build precisely to lead to those kind of situations? So that's how you're playing the game. That's your mindset as you go through it.
It in a way it's similar to other strategy games, but instead of thinking of how much ore and wood do I spend, you think of how do I spend my goodwill, which is in a way represented by a number in the game, but it's also just kind of a feel you get, right? How many turns have I spent chasing those green shields, which represent doing the honorable thing, and how many of those red swords can I now tank in a way?
Yes, and there's also a bit of a gamble to it, isn't there? Because when you launch a war, your reputation gets a hit because you've done something dishonorable. But the other part of reputation is respect, and you get respect by doing things that demonstrate strength. When you conquer a system, that demonstrates strength. So even if you conquer a system in a war that was unjustified and dishonorable, you will gain respect. So you might sometimes say, I'm going to take this risk because I think I can take that system easily. And the respect I'll get for just snatching it will partly kind of make up for the fact that I'm doing it with a very poor justification. So it's, you find yourself taking those gambles. Every time, once you learn the basics of Star Dynasties, you will almost find that you lose mainly when you overreach. Because even if the run of play goes against you, and you suddenly find, a vassal abandons you, or you have a particular run of bad luck, it's not the end. You might lose a part of your empire, but you can rebuild. You can kind of come back again. Maybe you die and your heir takes over, and they struggle a bit in the early part of their rule to kind of get everything back under control. It destabilizes a bit, so you get those shocks, and you get those negative situations. But the real loss scenarios are when you overreach and you just do too many nasty things at the same time, and suddenly a vassal abandons you. That makes you look weak, so your reputation tanks. Then another one doesn't show up. And suddenly it's this loop, and before you know it, you are despised and unloved and a pauper. And that's kind of it makes it that the only person you can blame very, very frequently in those situations is yourself.
It's I've been trying to keep my Game of Thrones references to a minimum so far, but it's a perfect perfect description of Littlefinger, which again is the way I play usually. And if they find out that I've been defaming just about everyone, that usually ends up with me losing the game. But
well, you just have to pair that with covering up those secrets, right?
See, that's where I'm messing up. I put all my points in security, and I should be putting some in diplomacy, so I can also kind of mend those fences when I break them. But I think that's a beautiful description of the way you need to look at this game, the mindset you need to have while playing. I know that's been a challenge to kind of translate, and that has improved a lot during early access. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have struggled a little bit to explain that we're not a typical strategy, that you don't play Star Dynasties like a typical 4X, and partly that was I've said this before. Partly it's my fault, because the game does look at first glance a little bit like a more typical 4X. And to be fair, that's because there's only so many ways you can draw a star map to, understand.
You need a map.
You need a map. Yeah. Although the point has been made, and I will accept it 100%, that we could also have gone for a different color on the UI. That would have drawn a little less comparisons to some other
I don't know what
things.
you mean.
That was a mistake, and absolutely my fault, and hopefully one that we will have the opportunity to correct.
Yeah, the early access in general, I think, obviously a little bit biased when I say this, but I think it's been a pretty good success in terms of user feedback. Maybe kind of rounding out this talk, what is maybe number one is a bit much, but what is one of your favorite pieces of feedback that you think has made the game much better going into full release?
Oof, it's going to be very hard to just narrow it down to one. I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. The early access has been hugely successful in terms of the amount of feedback we've got. Like, I keep saying, I have a list of 600 items of feedback, and of course that's daunting. But
Yeah.
in the same way that it's daunting to have gotten that much feedback, it's also it's in the last 6 months I've understood the game better than in the previous 2 years put together, and that's because it's now being played, and you can see how how players are experiencing it, and you can see what works and you can see what doesn't, and so it's been absolutely invaluable. And I mean, we've already mentioned a few things that have changed through user feedback, like the RNG on Unrest, and I can mention. I think the biggest thing we changed, I'm not going to say it's my favorite, but the biggest thing we changed is that when we launched, the game was showing the player too many events, too many notifications, too many pop-ups, and that was a little bit in my blind spot. And we fixed that, and that wasn't actually easy, because the way the game works, there are so many internal events, and it's hard to just have a blanket way to turn them down, because you run into this problem where, let's say, a ruler abandons a vassal. Now, you don't care about that if it happens on the other side of the galaxy.
Yeah.
But you do care about that if it happens on your border. So you can't even wield the ban hammer on these pop-ups at the level of the type of pop-up. You have to be a lot smarter. And you have to try to understand from the context whether the player would care about this or not. And it's a really big challenge. And we didn't get it right, definitely, when we launched. And we've improved considerably. And we've also now got a setting that the player can tweak. I mean, I would expect that many players, as they get towards the late game and they have a large empire in which many things are happening, that you might turn it down while you're in that phase of the game, so that you kind of reduce the mass of data that gets thrown at you. And it's absolutely improved the game significantly having put that in. I would say that might not be my favorite, but that is definitely the single biggest improvement we've made to the game based on player feedback through early access.
I also love about that pop-up menu is that you can change those sliders kind of based on what kind of pop-ups they are. So if you really care about your family, which you should in this game, you can change the family pop-ups to be more common than normal pop-ups. I think that's peak Star Dynasties right there.
Yeah, absolutely, and it gives you the room. I mean, it means that you can kind of shade the because some people might prefer to play the game more slowly and appreciate the little stories, even if that kind of lengthens the game. Or some players might be more focused on the pure strategy, win the galaxy. In which case, fair enough, you might turn those down, and that hopefully we can accommodate both play styles. But to come back to your question about what's my favorite piece of feedback, or at least what we've built, that I mentioned earlier that the game has a love mechanic, and that one of the pieces of feedback we got at the beginning was that it's a little bit outside of your control. And sometimes you fall in love and there's nothing you can do about it. And because it comes with an associated penalty unless you do something about it, it's obviously rubbed a few people the wrong way. And what that led to, with some discussion and further feedback, was the seduce mechanic that we're now adding to the game's final build, which is the idea that if your character falls in love with another ruler, or even if they don't, and you just want to exploit it for political gain, you can trigger this process where you try to seduce a character. And what happens is that you get, over the next few turns, you'll get events where your agents will find some kind of opportunity that you can bring yourself to the attention of that character. And you succeed in a couple of these opportunities, and then that gives you the opportunity to go in for the kill. And
I hope not.
Well, figuratively speaking, go
Okay,
in and
okay.
try to actually woo them and get them to fall in love with you. And obviously, if they do, they're much likelier. In fact, they're almost certainly going to kind of enter into some kind of relationship with you. And by relationship, I literally mean you could exploit that to kind of try to make them a part of your empire, or you could just use it to address the fact that you've fallen in love and you want to
Mhm.
pursue that.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to trying it out myself. I haven't played the actual release build yet. Um, I think that's gonna do it for now. It's a beautiful segue into the actual release, September 1st on Steam. If you're watching this, it probably already is out unless you're very early. In which case, thank you for being such a diehard. Glenn, thank you so much for joining me. 6 months of hard early access work, preceded by years of pre-early access hard work, and finally that mythical 1.0 has been achieved.
Yeah, it's been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but it's also been fun, and I'm really excited to see. I'm really excited to see how new players interact with the game. I'm really excited to see how the early access players will enjoy the new goodies that we've added since the last time they've seen it with colony installations and the new seduce mechanics. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's part of the fun now, seeing how players are going to hopefully really enjoy the game.
Yeah. And if you want to let us know how you feel about these changes, if you're an early access player or a new player, yeah, just jump on the Steam forums or jump on the Iceberg Interactive Discord, discord.gg/Iceberg Interactive, one word. I think that's it for us. Again, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Eric.